What I'll do is first I'll share the theory on how a movement is created, but then I will also show you how you could put that in action in order to create a movement for your cause. Now, the reason I decided to do a webinar on movement creation is because I've had many conversations with different organizations that wanted to do that. Of course, creating a movement is not as simple as using social media more, or talking to millennials, or maybe branding a product as movement. There are several elements to it that are more complicated, and basically there are two things. First, you need to find the people who would be your likely instigators, the ones that would initiate the whole thing. And you need to find what motivates them and what are the needs that they have, so you can satisfy that and so that they take an action. But also there are some characteristics that explain how a movement is built, and you need to create a situation that satisfies those three characteristics. So let me be more specific, and let's take them one by one. First one is preference falsification, which is a fancy way of saying that people don't always voice their true beliefs. And even in some cases, they might say the opposite of what they believe. And why does that happen? That's a combination of two things. The first one is that we might not always be aware of what the majority feels and thinks about an issue. And that, in combination with our desire to be accepted by the majority, can make us say the opposite of what we believe, or to be silenced, to not say anything. Now, the desire to protect our reputation, but not by not saying anything that will upset the majority or that will sound weird, is deeply rooted in human beings. So social pressure can actually make people say that they like something or they prefer something that they actually don't. Actually, if you think about it, it's very risky to stand up in front of people and voice an opinion that you already know that goes against the norm. And that brings me to the second characteristic, which is individual thresholds. What would take you to act in a specific situation? Maybe the best way to explain this is by sharing a personal experience. Now, years ago, when I was still studying in London, and after a night out, as I was walking down the street, I noticed that in front of me, a couple was arguing. Like, it was full on, very heated argument. And at some point it got physical. The guy started pushing and shoving the woman, and I just froze. I did nothing, and no one else did anything until there was this guy that stepped in and got in between the two, at which point I joined in, and then other people joined me as well. Now that guy, the first guy that stepped up, he didn't need anyone else to do anything in order for him to act. And that's why Professor Cass Sunstein calls these people zeros. Well, I call them heroes, but zeros reflects the fact that they don't need anyone else to do anything. They can act on their own. Now, in that situation, I was a one. I needed to see one more person do something in order for me to join in. And some other people have a slightly higher threshold, 2, 3, 10, 50. And of course, some people will never join. It doesn't matter how many others are doing the same thing, they will never join. Now, in that situation that I described, there was no preference falsification. I mean, everyone knew what the right thing to do was. It was all about the individual threshold, who will step up. But the combination of the two, and most importantly, the third factor, social interdependencies, decides on whether something will become a movement or not. So if people don't know that a belief is widespread, they won't join in. If actions are being taken, but they're not public, again, there's nothing for them to join. So what you need to do is inform your supporters that their beliefs around a cause, animals' rights, women's rights, humans' rights, whatever it might be, that their belief is a widespread one. You need to make it public. And you also need to show them that other people are taking action to support this cause. Because if I realize that the silent majority shares my beliefs, and depending on my threshold, if I have a low threshold, I might do something. I might speak up. I might act. And if I do, then someone else might see me and will join in. And social change happens when the majority all of a sudden doesn't support the status quo. And we're talking about movements. It's inevitable for me to mention the Me Too movement. What happened there? In the phrase Me Too was firstly used in 2006 on the platform called MySpace by an activist, Tarana Burke. Nothing happened after that for 11 years, until 2017, the actress Alyssa Milano asked other women to speak up. And that's when more and more women started joining. Now, was there no sexual harassment before 2017 or 2006? Of course not. Or other women never spoke up? Of course not. It's just that now they use the platform that could reach thousands of women at the same time about an issue. And that reached women with different individual thresholds. And that is what happened. If one woman spoke up and that was visible by thousands, the ones of the world then could speak up too, triggering like a cascade of reactions. So that is the theory. These are the three key elements that are needed to create a movement. And the first two are all about the individual, what you believe other people think, and whether your threshold is high or low in order to act. And the third one has to do how your individual beliefs come in contrast with what other people are doing. So to use the metaphor here on screen, how to create a movement. If one bird flies and another one follows, soon the whole flock will be in the air. And it's not that different with people too. It's just that you need to find someone who will take an action that needs to be visible by many others. So you can tap onto different individual thresholds so that can create the movement. Now, taking it back to fundraising, now is the other element I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, that you need to find the people who most likely are your instigators. And these will be your most committed supporters. You need to find their commitment to your organization, what motivates them, and what they need from you in order to use that to convince them to take an action. So any kind of action, whether that's giving money or speaking up, signing a petition, volunteering, whatever you ask your supporters to do, is determined by their commitment to your organization. Now, not everyone that walks in the door has the same level of commitment. The supporter's identity will give them the baseline commitment, will determine what their baseline commitment is. Now, supporter identity, you've heard of us talk about this before, but very briefly, it's the part of who they are that brings them to your cause. It's because they are environmentalists that they want to support a conservation charity. It's because they're a woman that they want to support women's rights, and so forth. So it's their intrinsic motivation that brings them to your cause, and that determines how committed they are to the cause. And it also determines what experiences matter to them. And by experiences in this case, I mean all the interactions that they have with your organization. And there are some experiences that they need. And if you are able to satisfy their needs and provide them with the touch points and interactions that they care about, that will also have an impact on their commitment to the organization. So commitment isn't static. They might walk in with a certain level of it, but what you do and your interactions with them will also influence, and you might increase or decrease their commitment. And then that will determine whether they take an action, any action. In this case, we're talking about movement creation. So we're mostly focused on non-financial actions, but if that's also true for donations. But at the moment, all you have on your database is information about what they do, their behavior. but you have nothing around who they are, their supporter identity, that is, their commitment, and what experiences matter to each identity. So when it comes to applying all this theory, you need to start with a piece of insight work that discovers all that. So basically discovers your supporters' identities, and then you take a look at everything that you do, from brand messages to the communications you send them, your online activity, your offline activity, everything, every interaction that you possibly have with your supporters. And this piece of work, which I'm not going to go into details on the methodology, that's not the point of this, but very briefly will tell you, from everything that you do and you put in front of your supporters, what are the things that drive their commitment and value, and also action, of course. And whether these experiences that drive commitment and value are the same or different for each of your supporters' identities. And as an example, that's what we did with one of our clients, a conservation charity. And by the end of it, we found that there were two identities, two supporter identities. Let's call them identity A and identity B. And looking at the brand messages that the charity was using, we saw that there were some differences. Like the first two brand messages were equally important for both identities. But then there were some brand messages that were important just for identity A, for example, protecting birds by preserving their habitat, or buying land to protect nature. That only mattered for identity A, while the messages, choices in everyday life to help conservation and educating children about nature, was only important for identity B. So at this stage, you know what their identities are and what are the experiences that matter to them. And like I said, this insights work doesn't really stop on what language and brand messages to use, but also whether the magazine is important for both identities or just for one of them or for neither of them, whether your impact reports are important. So everything that you do, you'll know what matters for each identity. So you know that if you use the things that matter for each identity, you will increase their commitment, and then you're going to be able to influence their behavior. So after you finish this insights project and you know all that, what you need to do is go back to your supporters and capture that information. The commitment study, as we call that, insights project, will provide you with the identity question that you need to use. And that's going to be different for every organization because there are different causes. So for the previous example, for a previous client, the identity question was whether they are bird enthusiasts or nature enthusiasts. And it was just one question, choose one of the two, and you knew where to, how to segment your supporters based on that. Secondly, you need to ask how committed they are to your organization. And that's not a fuzzy concept. There are 3 questions that you can use where you can measure it. It's 3 statements. I'm a committed supporter of this organization. I feel a sense of loyalty to this organization, or this organization is my favorite one. And you take the average of these 3 statements to arrive at the commitment score of a specific supporter. And now that you know that, you need to capture that on your database, because you need to use that information to segment your file differently based on their identity, which is their motivation to support your organization, and based on their commitment. And since we're talking about movement creation, you need to focus on your highly committed supporters and tailor messages based on their identity in order to nudge them to take an action. And that's exactly what step 3 and the final step is doing. So you need to create a journey specifically for highly committed supporters, and you need to tailor the journey based on their identity and use the language and the communications and touch points that you found increase their commitment based on the insights work that you've done, and then nudge them to take an action. So as an example, if this is a screenshot of a journey, each row represents a different identity. Both rows are about highly committed supporters. Each column represents a different time length. It could be months, it could be days. And each box is a different touch point. And the different colors represent different channels. So yellow is email, red is magazine, dark blue is DM. So what happens here? We welcome them with an email, which is tailored based on their identity. We prime who they are, and we use the language that we know that increases their commitment. But the commitment study doesn't always, as I said, that doesn't just tell us what language to use, it also tells us what touch points to use. So for example, maybe we found from the insights work that the magazine is important to identity A, but not to identity B. That's why we only place it and we show it to that segment. Or maybe we found that the impact report that we have is only important for identity B, so we only use that for that segment. So we know what language to use for its identity, what offers to put in front of them in order to increase their commitment. And now we need to also add touch points that lay the groundwork for movement creation. Maybe you can ask them to take part in a quiz where we ask them to find how close our values are. And through that quiz, they don't only share their own values, but most importantly, we show them that what they think and believe about the cause is shared by many other people, not just us as the organization, but with many others. So that is important so that you tackle the preference falsification element. If you show them that many others believe in that, and if their threshold to act is low, then you have a higher chance in replying or responding to any act-related email that you send them afterwards. And that's the plan. So in month 2, you'll see that I've added 2 emails. One maybe offers them value exchange, some information around something they care about, and we ask them to share it with like-minded people. So that's a softer ask to get them engaged. But also then you can go push harder and ask them to sign a petition and share it with other people. So, and with everyone that they know, not just like-minded people. And it's not just about information they would care about, so it's something that they get back, but it's about promoting the cause. And this is where you start building the movement. Of course, it's not going to be built in 2 months. This is an illustration of a journey that can last for several months. And the important thing is that you use platforms that make these actions visible to many of your supporters, because the trick is to find your zeros through this process by starting with your most committed supporters and ask them to take actions that all of your supporters will see. So then you can tap onto their individual thresholds and begin that process and that cascade where more and more people join in until you have a movement in your hands. So that was the webinar. Please let me know if you have any questions, and if you'd like more information on how to put that in action, do get in touch.